This conference will now be recorded.
So, thank you very much for being with us this afternoon. For those of us who are in the UK this evening, for those of us who are in continental Europe, or this morning for Trevor, who has probably just woke up in Los Angeles, where he's based, for this great seminar. So we have the privilege tonight of having with us Professor Trevor Zink, who is Associate Professor of Management and Sustainability. Please switch off your microphones if you are joining. Thank you. I was saying Associate Professor of Management and Sustainability at the College of Business Administration at Loyola Marymount University in California. Trevor is an expert in life cycle assessment methodologies, in material end-of-life management and circular economy. And the distinctiveness of Trevor's work lies in his questioning of the environmental value of recycling and the circular economy, looking at the unintended consequences of the circular economy in a market environment. Trevor has published this work in top peer-reviewed journals, and his main question, his main research question at the moment, is exploring how to design economic systems that can survive the 21st century. So the most recent paper that Trevor has authored calls for a new economic system that can address both the labor and environmental crisis we are now facing. So this seminar is hosted by the Retrace Network. The Retrace Network is a EU-funded doctoral program that runs across 10 partner institutions across Europe and aims at keeping a cohort of early stage researchers with models, methods, and thinking for building the economic system Trevor is talking about. So an economic system that can survive in the 21st century. So I won't be taking any further time. I'll hand it over to Trevor for a very insightful speech, and then we can have a Q&A after that. Over to you, Trevor, and once again, thank you for being with us.
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. Thanks for having me. And thanks to everybody for showing up. I'm going to share my screen quickly. Here we go. That should work. Yes.
You can see the slides.
Say it again.
No, okay. Just say it works perfectly. Thank you, Trevor.
Good. Yeah, thanks for showing up. I know in the virtual world, in some ways, it's easier to show up for things, and in some ways, it's way easier not to show up for things. So, thanks for coming. Am I frozen here?
No, we can see you. We can hear you. The slides are on.
You were frozen, so I wasn't sure. All right. So yeah, and I realize yeah, I'm having my morning coffee here, but I know I'm cutting into your cocktail hour, so I apologize for that. Unless, of course, you've already started with cocktail hour, in which case, you know, cheers. So So do you guys usually do questions afterwards or during? I'm happy with either. If you,
As you prefer, as you prefer. I mean,
yeah, either way is fine with me. If you want to stop me at any point, feel free. It is, as I'm sure you know now, it's a bit unnerving looking at a grid of black squares. So if we have the bandwidth for it, and you're not actually at the pub, then if you could turn your camera on, that's better. All right. So what I'm going to be talking to you about today is a compilation of work that I published over the last 5 years. And it is, so I'm still trying to navigate this interface. It's different than Zoom. All right, so work that we published over the last 5 years, there's a lot more to dig into. I can send you these papers. Of course, maybe you already have them. And what's kind of exciting is in the last 5, 6 years, this topic of rebound, or really of questioning the circular economy generally, has started to gain some traction. And it turns out that when you start loudly questioning the benefit of something that's as widely loved as recycling, you get noticed and you end up having to explain yourself on the national news, which is both great and, if you're like me, extremely terrifying. But this was a fun opportunity to sort of get the short 5-minute version of this out to the general public in America anyway, which was cool. So I want to give you a bit of background. I'm gonna stop sharing for a second. The background here, which may be useful because I understand we have some doctoral students on the call. And so just how I ended up here. I showed up to start my PhD at the University of California in Santa Barbara, and I was ready to study environmental things, right? So I was a bit shocked and frankly a little bit annoyed when my advisor, Roland Geyer, said to me on the first day, he said, "All right, go and be an economist." I said, "What? No, I want to study environment. I'm not here to be an economist." He said, "Nah, yeah, but everybody in industrial ecology, everyone in this field is an engineer. Everyone comes at it from an engineering background. And so nobody understands the economic factors. So go be an economist and you'll have something to add to this discussion." So I did. I went and took all the econ classes that UCSB has to offer. And it's interesting because once you start looking at the environmental consequences of industrial systems through an economic lens rather than an industrial lens or an engineering lens, things that seem to be obviously helping suddenly seem to be less obvious or even obviously harmful. So a lesson that could be useful to the doctoral students in the room was, well, I guess the first lesson is trust your advisor because they know what they're doing. They might just know something. And the second lesson is that if you can approach an old problem from a new perspective or from a new theoretical frame, it can open up new possibilities. It can open up new answers, new ways to answer a question that's been looming. So the doctoral work is by its nature kind of working within a very thin slice of the literature to answer a very particular question. But sometimes the way to answer that question lies in being able to coalesce multiple disparate disciplines and bring them together in new ways. So, all right, 2020 has taught us that life is short, the future is uncertain, so eat dessert first. So I'm going to give you basically an outline of the whole talk here in a few bullet points. First, I'm going to introduce the idea of the circular economy as I see it, so we're all on the same page about what we're talking about. Then I'm going to demonstrate some of its potential problems and its potential, the way it can potentially help, and potential problems by focusing mainly on recycling, but we'll talk about the other activities as well. So I'm going to start by showing that the main reason, that the most common reason why people think we should recycle has very little to do with the actual real benefit that recycling has to offer. And this demonstrates that the real benefit is actually in preventing primary production of materials, but that preventing primary production is not a guarantee. Recycling might not actually displace enough material to make it worthwhile. We'll talk about just some brief. I'll sort of gloss over the technical paper where I get into actually estimating this displacement rate. And then we'll also talk about how this story gets even worse by talking about how some of the psychology and behavioral changes that recycling can cause. And then we'll talk briefly about the the other circular economy activities and how they work into this. And then we're going to close by asking if there are ways that we can improve the circular economy, and are those ways realistic within the economic paradigm that we've created? And if not, then what does that mean? I am going to keep this at a fairly high non-technical level. We can dig into any technical aspects of anything that you want, but just to keep it sort of more interesting and accessible, I'm going to just talk in less technical terms. So I'm going to restart the share here and kick things off. All right, so we have had, as you know, as people who are working in this space, there's been recent interest in this circular economy. The idea is that instead of having a linear economy where we pull things out of the ground, turn them into products, use those products, and then put those things back into the ground in a landfill, wouldn't it be great if we had some way to cycle materials to extract their full value, to reduce impacts in the process? So the thing that people have talked about here is the circular economy. Right, where instead of having a line, we now have these nice circles that products and materials all go around and around and around. And the idea is that instead of being dissipative, the CE is by its nature regenerative, or at least non-dissipative. And as you know, there are billions of dollars at this point of investments. There's regulations being created worldwide, particularly over on your side of the pond, a lot of money and regulatory energy going into encouraging circular economy activities and investments. And of course, it sounds intuitively like an environmentally good thing, right? Why wouldn't we want to reuse things as many times as possible? Why wouldn't we want to cycle things? Unfortunately, we've sort of barreled into this idea based on that assumption that it sounds like an intuitively good thing without ever actually investigating whether or not that's true. So that's what we're going to get into a little bit today. So the first thing that we need to be clear about, though, is what we're talking about when we say the circular economy, because it makes sense on one level, and then it's kind of been co-opted or expanded to include a lot of other activities. What I mean by the circular economy is reuse at 3 different levels: either reuse of products, which we call reuse, right? Just reusing something over and over again. Reuse of components, which we call refurbishment, right? Where you're taking something apart, changing out some of the components and reselling it. And then the last level is the reuse of materials, which we call recycling. So first, to demonstrate why the circular economy the potential to help the environment, I'm going to look at the circular economy activity that most people think of first. Whether or not that's right or good, this is the activity that most people think of first, which is recycling. Okay, so it is probably impossible to overstate the cultural importance that we place on recycling. It's like a religion at this point. It's a litmus test for how good of a person you are. Do you recycle or not, right? Everyone knows that it's the right thing to do, but why is it a good thing to do? Right? We all in the room probably have some better idea than most people about why we recycle, and I could ask you and put you on the spot, but I won't. But I will say that the general public generally has the wrong idea about this. So, for instance, 81% of Americans, and maybe Americans are unique in this, but 81% of Americans think that we recycle. The primary reason is to reduce landfills, reduce the amount of stuff we're putting into landfill. This, however, is not true. In one of the papers that I showed you at the first slide, I can demonstrate. If you're not convinced by the end of this, then go read that paper. But basically, the intuition here is once something is made, it has to go somewhere, right? Conservation of mass says that we have to do something with those molecules. So even if we can manage to cycle it a number of times, every time the product goes through or the materials go through a collection and reprocessing cycle, it's going to lose some of the molecules. And certainly with certain materials, it's going to lose some of the usability, the durability of the material. So at some point it ends up in the landfill, right? You might say, start with the PET water bottle, we recycle that into a fleece jacket, and then that fleece jacket gets recycled into a speed bump or a park bench, and then eventually it needs to go to a landfill. So even materials that can be recycled more efficiently, like the metals, through entropy, they're still going to dissipate and end up in the natural world in landfills somewhere. Right? So once something is made, it has to go somewhere. Generally, that somewhere is a landfill, but it can also just be dissipation to the natural world. So no, recycling does not actually prevent landfill, it merely delays it. The reality is, there's another strong reason why preventing landfill would be a silly reason to recycle, which is that collecting and reprocessing materials does not come environmentally free, right? We have to operate the trucks, we have to operate the material recovery facilities, we've got to melt things down. And so, for instance, in the case of aluminum, sorry, you'll have to pardon my American pronunciation here throughout, aluminium, right? The impacts in terms of global warming to collect and sort and reprocess a kilogram of aluminum releases 1.6 kilograms of CO2 equivalent. Whereas putting that same kilogram in the ground releases just the impacts of driving the truck to the landfill, essentially. So we're talking 0.01 kilograms of CO2 release. So if this was the only reason that we wanted to avoid putting things in landfill, then recycling would be really, really dumb, because we'd be trading very, very small impacts for much larger impacts. Fortunately, that is not why we recycle. The primary reason why we recycle is that it has the potential to displace primary production. So again, the recycling processes for aluminum release 1.6 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram recycled. But to make that same kilogram of aluminum from bauxite, from the raw material, releases 11.4 kilograms of CO2. So if we can prevent these 11.4 kilograms of emissions with these 1.6, then that's a very good thing. I will have to warn you, I'm gonna sloppily use the shorthand of just increased impacts or decreased impacts. It's just a shorthand. You can replace the word impacts for whatever impact category you care about: global warming, acidification, eutrophication. You can replace it with a specific emission that you're interested in. The general pattern is still going to hold true. So the idea is, right, we have some savings from recycling if we can replace primary production with secondary production. And this holds true generally for all of the commonly recycled materials, except for paper, because in the case of global warming, because the trees actually sequester carbon as they grow. But mostly the impacts of primary production are much larger than the impacts of secondary production. So in general, we can say that the savings from recycling are the avoided primary impacts, the avoided landfill impacts, minus the reprocessing impacts. And now you're going to say, wait a minute, Trevor, you just said that recycling doesn't actually avoid any landfill. Right? Why do we get to subtract the avoided landfill impacts here? Well, we can avoid anything that we don't make, we also don't have to throw away. So if we avoid the primary production, then we also avoid the landfill from that primary production. But if we don't avoid the primary production, then we don't avoid the landfill. So those two benefits are actually, they're one and the same. All right, so how are we doing? We got our general equation here for the benefit of recycling, the avoided primary plus the avoided landfill minus the reprocessing impacts. And this is how we generally think about it in the industrial ecology life cycle assessment world. It's this, when we introduce recycling to a system, it's generally conceived like this, basically an engineering system where we have processes and flows, where we have primary material production that goes into manufacturing some product and using that product. And then instead of going to a landfill, we collect it, reprocess it, and put it right back into manufacturing and use. However, this picture of how the common perception of this recycling system is incorrect. And to see why, I don't know what fields you all come from, but if you're engineers, I want you to take off your engineering hat and instead put on a business or economics hat and think about what would be required for this picture to be accurate. Basically what we're saying is every time, let's just use an aluminum can, for instance, a soda can. Every time we collect and reprocess an aluminum can, we prevent 1 can's worth of aluminum from being created from bauxite. It's a 1-to-1 displacement. We have 1 can being recycled, 1 less can being produced. Now, how would this work in real life? Right? Would it be? Is it the case that the waste management company, they collect the recycling, they look in the bag, they see there's a can in the recycling bin, so they get on the phone with Alcoa in Chile, and they say, hey, we collected a can, we're going to recycle it, so can you please reduce your aluminum production this month by 1 can's worth? Thanks very much. No, of course not, right? That's not how this communication works. The actual communication works because it's mediated through marketplaces. So what this diagram is missing here is a critical step where there is a materials market that sits in between the manufacturers of either primary or secondary material and the users of those materials. When you realize that there's a market here, then the idea that every time we recycle 1 unit of material, we automatically produce 1 unit less starts to sound less and less credible. For that to be true, a couple things would have to be the case. For one, the demand of these people who are buying material and turning that material into products would have to be completely fixed, meaning they would have to be totally unresponsive to any changes in price. If the price of material of this material, whatever it is, if it's aluminum, if it goes up, they still buy the same amount. If it goes down, they still buy the same amount. So that if they're buying it from the secondary folks, the people who are recycling it, they buy it there and then they don't buy it from primary, right? That's what would have to be the case. Also, it would have to be the case that these folks, both the primary and secondary producers, can only sell into this one market. For instance, they can't go and try to compete with other materials in different markets, which of course is also not true, right? We can say, well, aluminum is a replacement for not only recycled aluminum, but it's a replacement for steel, it's a replacement for plastic, it's a replacement for different building materials, and this is true of all the recycled materials, right? They compete for different things. So these two requirements, fixed demand, meaning complete non-responsiveness to price changes. Well, find me a market where that's the case, right? Outside of maybe insulin, find me a market that is where the users of the material are completely unresponsive to changes in price. Certainly, you're not going to find it for a standard commodity material like the ones that we're talking about. And then also a market where the sellers in the market can't go and compete elsewhere. So when we realize that would have to be the case, all of a sudden this assumption that's baked into this top diagram that it's 1-for-1 displacement starts to sound pretty unreasonable. In reality, the basic laws of supply and demand, which are at work in a simple market like these material markets, these are competitive markets, they're global, there's nothing unusual about these markets from an economic standpoint. When we move from a system that doesn't have recycling to a system that does have recycling, what we're doing is we're creating an influx of material into these secondary markets. We're basically increasing the amount of material that's coming out of these secondary producers into this market. When we increase the amount of material that's going into this market, the prices of the materials will drop, right? Supply goes up, price goes down. As the price goes down, the primary material producers are going to say, hey, we're having our lunch eaten by these secondary producers, right? Everyone's going to the secondary producers to go and buy their material. We need to be competitive, so they lower their prices. They lower their prices, and then these people say, oh, well, now the primary material is a little bit cheaper, cool. And we don't know exactly where this new equilibrium ends up without doing more work to estimate the supply and demand elasticities of this market. But we do know that as soon as if you've got two goods that are substitutes, as soon as you apply a subsidy or a supply increase to one of the goods, then we know that the prices of both goods go down, which means as the prices go down, the people who are buying that material say, oh, sweet, our costs are lower. I'm going to increase my production. I'm going to find new uses for this material that we weren't using it before, right? We're going to open up new markets. The materials are so cheap, I'm going to make more things with them. So the consumption of both goods goes up. And again, we don't know exactly where the new equilibrium lies, but we know the prices of both goods are lower, the consumption of both goods is higher. So if consumers, in this case, people who buy materials and turn those materials into products, if they respond to changes in price, which they always do, then increasing the supply of one good will not automatically reduce the consumption of the substitute good by the same amount. Right? We can say this with certainty. In reality, the primary and secondary versions of all these recycled products that we're talking about are substitutes, but they're also not the only substitutes. As we've said, these suppliers can enter new markets, and so this becomes even more complicated. So this assumption that more A equals less B is just that, and it's an assumption, and it's really not an assumption that's founded on any economic theory. So what we really want to know is not, okay, one-to-one, A goes up, B goes down, but by how much does B go down when we increase A? And this we can call the displacement rate, right? A change in B per change in A, change in primary material production per increase in recycling. Once we have this concept of displacement rate, we can amend, and again, please stop me if you have a question as we go through here. But once we have this concept of displacement rate, we can amend our equation for the benefit of recycling to say, no, the benefit of recycling isn't the avoided primary plus the avoided landfill minus the reprocessing. It's only the proportion that we actually avoid. Right, so if a 1 unit increase in recycling results in a half a unit decrease in primary production, then we have to divide these benefits in half. We're going to multiply this by 0.5. Now, we can start to say some interesting things once we have this D in this equation. Because now we can say, look, if D is 1, if displacement rate is 1 or 100%, then we multiply this quantity by 1, and we end up with exactly the same equation that we started out with before. The standard assumption is correct, and the benefit of recycling is positive. If D is 0, meaning recycling doesn't displace any primary production, then this whole quantity goes away, and the benefit of recycling is equivalent to the minus reprocessing impacts, meaning recycling makes things worse than if we just threw things in the trash can, in the landfill. So D of 1 means things are like we thought, and recycling makes things better. D of 0 means recycling makes things worse than just landfilling stuff, which means there is some D somewhere between 0 and 1 where recycling is neither good nor bad. It's the crossover point. We can call it the break-even displacement rate. We can find the break-even displacement rate by simply setting this equation equal to 0 and solving for D. And notice that the break-even displacement rate is going to be different for each material because the reprocessing impacts, the avoided primary production impacts, and the avoided landfill impacts are different for every material. It will also be different for every impact category. So for aluminum, for just using those numbers that we had a few slides ago for global warming, the break-even displacement rate is 14%. right? You can go back and check my math looking at the slides there. But basically, when you recycle a kilogram of aluminum, as long as you displace 140 grams of primary production or more, then recycling that kilogram of aluminum was worth it, environmentally speaking. You've lowered net impacts. If it's less than 14%, then every kilogram of aluminum that you recycle actually makes things worse, not better. Now, estimating these displacement rates is extremely hard. Having spent basically my whole PhD time trying to do it, I can tell you it's not a fun weekend activity. And when you estimate it, you end up with pretty significant error bars just based on all the uncertainty and the lack of data that goes into these things. But the best that we could come up with, and this is again one of these papers at the beginning, is that the actual displacement rate for recycling aluminum in the United States is around 10%. Which means every time an American throws a can in the recycling bin, we actually make things worse, not better. So that's really depressing. Yeah, no, it's just depressing. I will share with you, but you know, this is not published data, and I'm not sure it ever will be published data based on the work that we did to get it. But the break-even for global warming, the break-even displacement rate for steel is 23%, and we've estimated steel displacement at about 63%. So it's a better story there. Of course, steel is not really a very common consumer product, right? Steel is widely used in automotive and in construction, right? But not really not really a consumer product.
Trevor, yeah, I think there is a question in the chat. Are you happy to take it now or later?
Let me have a look at it really quick. What methods for calculating the avoided impacts did you use, and what software? Okay, so when you say that calculating the avoided impacts, you mean coming up with estimating this displacement rate?
Yeah, like the values for the avoided primary and landfill impacts. Like you talked a bit about it earlier, like in CO2 for aluminum.
Sure. Yeah. So the greenhouse gas emission data I'm using just comes from the European Aluminum Association. I think I pulled them out of Gabi at some point, but I think it's EAA data. The displacement rate estimation comes from doing basically estimating a supply and demand model for trades of aluminum, so price and quantity data for aluminum over the last 40 or so years, and controlling for various things that might affect supply and demand of aluminum besides just price. These numbers, the break-evens, these are super easy. Anybody with Gabi or an internet browser can come up with these numbers. The estimating the displacement rate is the actual displacement rate is much more complicated and has much bigger error bars. Good question. Thank you. And actually, it's a good time for other questions about what we've talked about so far, because this is kind of the story on at least the economic part of recycling. In the next slide, I'm going to talk about the behavioral part of recycling, and then we'll move into some of the other circular economy activities. So it's a good breaking point if you have any other questions here.
Any other questions? Okay.
Cool. All right, so this is bad news for consumer recycling, right? That we actually make things worse, not better. And granted, there are error bars on this 10%, and they definitely span 14%, right? It's possible that the actual displacement rate is higher than 14%, but our point estimate is 10. This isn't the worst part of the story, in my opinion, and this is one of these situations where you have a good idea for a paper, and then you go and you search the literature and you discover that somebody has already done it, and it's one of these heartbreaking moments, because this is really cool and I can't take any credit for it. Remy Trudel and his colleagues have published a series of papers around the same time that we were working on all this, where they study the effect of recycling on people's consumptive choices. So basically what they did is they brought people into a behavioral economics lab and had them do a series of tasks. So they had them, for instance, do math for which they needed scratch paper, or they had a bucket of pens that they could take a pen for free, or they had them wrap gifts in wrapping paper, or sample juice using disposable cups. And the only difference in the control versus the treatment was that for the treatment group, there was a recycling bin in the room. The control group had a trash can, the treatment group had a trash can and a recycling bin in the room, and they weren't given any instructions about disposing of the things. The only difference is a recycling bin in the room. And when the recycling bin was in the room, people took more pens, they used more paper to do their math homework, they used more paper to wrap their presents, and they used more cups to sample the juice. Significantly more. And they interviewed these folks afterwards about their environmental self-identification, about their feelings of how good of an environmental person they are. So recycling's in the room, recycling bin in the room, people use more stuff and they felt better about themselves while doing it. This is really problematic because we have been doing, all of the recycling, we'll call it advertising, right? All of the public messaging about recycling, about environmentalism for the last 30 years or so has said you have to recycle. Recycling, not only if you don't recycle, you're a bad person, but if you do recycle, you're a good person. And the problem isn't that this messaging hasn't worked, it's that the problem is the messaging has worked too well, such that people now associate the act of recycling with good environmental behavior, focusing entirely on the disposal side of things, not focusing at all on the true problem, which is the production side of things. That once you have actually bought the product, once you've purchased the can or the pen or the paper or whatever it is, the damage is done at that point. Which bin you put it in is, environmentally speaking, of almost no consequence. You've already done the damage by inducing the primary production or the production of the thing in the first place. So there's a big behavioral piece to this, which is really troubling. All right, just checking in with everyone really quick. So we know that the circular economy is reuse, repair, refurbishment, recycling. We recycle in hopes that we will prevent more primary production, that's enough to make it worth it, but there's no guarantee. There's no rule of law that says when you recycle, you automatically displace primary production. In fact, there is a lot of evidence to say that we will not displace primary production, and the very fact that recycling is around can cause us to consume more. All right, I'm going to move it along here fairly quickly now. Refurbishment, the potential benefit of refurbishment is, of course, that when we refurbish something, it has lower impacts than making something from new. And if we can refurbish something and displace primary production, then we can save the difference in those impacts. Potential problem, of course, is that, again, there's no guarantee that these refurbished products are actually going to substitute for new products. One of the prime case studies on refurbished products is smartphones or cell phones. And we know that it's a pretty rare person who is in the market for either a new smartphone or a refurbished smartphone, right? These things aren't really substitutes for most people. Generally, these refurbished phones are going to be sold into markets where primary or new phones are not an option because they're too expensive. So we pretty much know that we're not getting any primary production displacement from refurbished phones. But it's worth thinking about other products, and some of these products are less well studied. If you're looking for a research project here, we could look at used clothes, used cars, refurbishing buildings, these sorts of things. And the question, of course, is will these refurbished products actually displace the primary alternatives? If they don't, then we've increased overall impacts. We've not cut into primary production impacts. Similar story on reuse. This is a picture of the building where I'm actually sitting right now. And out front of this building, my university is very proudly displaying this big wave that they've made out of old plastic bottles. This thing has been sitting here now for about 3 years, I believe. And they say, look at how cool we are. We have reused these bottles and repurposed them into art. And it's like, well, how is this helping, right? Are these bottles replacing? Would you have made this wave sculpture out of primary production bottles if you didn't have the used bottles to use? No, of course not. You just wouldn't have made it. So these bottles that are being reused really aren't displacing any primary production. And if you can think of your grandmother with all of her glass jars and vases on the various shelves around her house with flowers in them, are these being reused, or are they just sitting there collecting dust? If they're not displacing anything, then reuse doesn't actually help. The problem here is that reusable items, you think your reusable plastic water bottle rather than your single-use bottle, this is much heavier. There's much more material involved in this. So there's an impact debt at production that I have to work off over time by reusing this enough times to displace a sufficient number of single-use bottles to make this worthwhile. And will I use, I've used this one enough, I know, but I also have this one that was just given to me at the beginning of the year, and got another few cups. You guys are probably in the same situation. You go to a conference and you get a reusable bottle, and they say, oh, look how cool we are because we're saving the world with these reusable bottles. Now all of a sudden you've got 10 reusable bottles, and you've got 10x the debts that you have to work off. And it actually gets more complicated, because when I use this bottle, am I displacing a primary production single-use bottle, or am I just displacing this bottle? I don't know. I don't know how to do the calculation on that one anymore. So that's the potential problem with reusables, and people miss the point on this all the time. In California, I think like many places in the UK, we have a ban on single-use shopping bags. And to try to assess the effectiveness of this, CalRecycle, which is California's waste management group, they did some surveys, and they just hung out in grocery stores and watched people's bag usage, and they said 11% of people are using reusable bags, and they said this is a clear win, right? The bag ban, we're 11% reusable. To which I ask, what if those 11% of reusable bags every time were new bags, right? People go in and they're like, oh shoot, I know I'm supposed to have a reusable bag, and they buy a reusable bag, and then they go the next time and they buy a reusable bag. If they were all new bags and those reusable bags aren't actually being used in place of single-use bags, then we've made things for up to 300% worse. Here's another one. I own these reusable bags, and the thing on the front cracks me up, because it says using this reusable bag keeps hundreds of disposable plastic bags out of landfills and from littering our cities, rivers, and oceans. To which I ask, or which I say, well, only if it's actually displacing a single-use bag. Also, disposal is not the problem here, the production is. And is not the real problem that these single-use bags are littering our cities, rivers, and oceans, right? This is actually a waste collection problem, not a reuse problem. Okay, so this has been a whirlwind. I want to get to questions and discussions and hear what you guys are working on. The basic story is this is the engineer's diagram, nice clean circles just connecting to one another. The economist's diagram says this is actually much more complicated, because in between each of these steps is a market and user behavior that can really throw things awry, so that we can end up with circular economy rebound, where we expect this circular economy activity to have lower impacts than the primary production alternative. But when we move to the circular economy activity, we can actually increase production. Boom, moves over here. And now we were expecting this benefit from E0 to E1, and we actually only get the benefit from E0 to E2, because this part was rebounded. And if we believe Remy Trudel, we might actually reuse, increase our production so much that we backfire, that we expect a benefit here, but we actually end up making things worse, not better. You guys have maybe seen this diagram in the paper, but there's basically 4 different quadrants of possibility here. And the dangerous ones are the circular economy rebound parts and the potential shortfall when it comes to reuse. All right, let's skip ahead here to how do we avoid rebound? Well, the first thing is we got to change our language. We have to stop focusing on circularity, right? There's a lot of papers I see out these days that try to measure resource circularity, and that totally misses the point, right? You really want to maximize the displacement potential of the secondary things and measure how much displacement is actually happening. That probably means if we're going to maximize the displacement potential, we probably need to reduce or stagnate overall material consumption. However, that is really, really hard because that means selling the same amount or less stuff. And that's a hard sell from a business perspective. In fact, McKinsey and Company, the consulting firm, they say, yeah, go do the circular economy stuff because it looks great. It's good PR. But make sure your circular economy activities are not cannibalizing your primary production activities, because then you'll lose money. As in saying, make sure that you're not displacing primary production, make sure that you're not actually realizing the environmental benefit here, because if you do, then you'll lose money. So that's a real problem. And this probably means we need to stagnate or slow the economy, which isn't feasible in a capitalist global economy. So maybe it is time for something new. Inconvenient solution here, of course, is source reduction, buying less stuff. And the hard problem is how to make that work realistically. So I'm gonna stop sharing now and hopefully get some of your insight on this. I'm excited to hear what you guys are working on and exchange ideas on this.
Thank you very much, Trevor, for this excellent talk. I really enjoyed it, and I'm sure by the comments I'm getting also in private chat, a lot of people have too. So I think we have got a lot of questions. I think Akis would like to go first. And then other people who want to sign up for questions, please write in the chat. You can just write your name and I'll call you up and you ask the question. Akis, go first.
Thank you, Professor, for your presentation. Quite insightful. And as you said, the primary aim should be to reduce the primary production. And at the end of your webinar, you also talked about this reductionist approach towards the economy. Isn't it a good reason to start actually pointing out the function of reduce rather than emphasizing on just closing the loops?
Yeah, 100%. It's, you look at the waste management hierarchy, reduce, reuse, recycle, right? We all know that reduction comes first, but reduction is in a lot of ways incompatible with the incentives that we have in the world, right? The economic incentives that we have. Try to go start a company and try to raise money for a new company and tell your investors, well, I'm never going to grow the company. My goal is not to grow the company. I want to sell exactly 100 widgets forever. And your investors will say, well, how am I going to get a return on my investment? And you're going to say, well, you're not, right? I want to reduce primarily. And they'll say, okay, well, I'm going to take my investment dollars elsewhere. And the other problem with reduction is, this is the subject of my latest paper that Andrea was talking about, that capitalism tends towards efficiency, and the primary way to increase efficiency is to trade people for machines. You go from 100 factory workers to 10 machine technicians to 1 computer programmer, which means you now have 99 people out of a job, which means you need to create enough new jobs to employ these 99 people. Otherwise, they stop spending money, they reduce investment in these new companies. It's a self-reinforcing spiral down to the bottom. We've seen this, right, in 2008. All the governmental messaging in 2008 was go spend money for the good of the economy, right? Because we know when spending reduces, then investment reduces, and then there's no new jobs for people. So yes, you're exactly right. We need to focus on the reduction piece. It's not clear to me, and someone said, Stefan said in the chat, what's the positive message? Yo, this is where I I try to drum up some positivity for my students, but it's hard because the reduction has to be the answer, but I don't know how to square reduction with the realities of the economic and political systems that we have in place. And if you can solve this problem, I want to join your research team.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you.
Please, Mario would like to ask a question.
Hello, good morning to you in the US. And I'm very sorry that I lost the first part of your presentation. So, but I read a couple of your papers, so I know what you aiming at. So I have one question. A lot of things that you are talking about resonates with what in Europe we call the degrowth movements, right? One of the main criticisms of the degrowth movements is that our society, I mean, the fundamental basis of our economy and society is based on this idea of compound interest, no? So we are supposed to grow 3%, which is more or less the kind of rate that the company expects when when venture capitalists expect, at least a minimum. So it's really ingrained in our society. So my question is, what do you think about that? How is possible? Because it seems that we need to reform the bank system, right? The way we produce money, we create money. So what do you think about this? And if this somehow would be impossible without like political action? So this is something that we don't need to do only from an academic or engineering and technical perspective, but we need like we need to take action on the political ground. Thank you.
Yeah, good question. Interesting that both questions so far are about degrowth, which is cool because this is where my thinking is now. Because when you follow this line of thinking down, you do get to this. You end up in this dead end where you say this doesn't work, right? The circular economy in this economic regime that we have is almost guaranteed to increase rather than decrease impacts. So it's the economic regime that's the problem. Do we need to rethink banking? I'm sure we do. Do we need to? Does this have to be a political thing? Yes, but at what level is the problem, right? The other, and this is actually where I thought the question was going to go. The other complication here is that as we talk about degrowth, we need to simultaneously talk about a leveling out of the sort of global economic playing field, because we in the US and in Western Europe, we can afford to degrow. I don't think it's feasible in this economy, but we could certainly afford to degrow. We have more than we need. Whereas there are many places in the world that can't degrow. So it has to be sort of a leveling out. I don't know that I have. I mean, I think the answer is yes. This needs to be. We need to rethink the banking model, and this has to come at some level from policy. But it's not just a policy problem. It's also a sort of a behavioral problem, right? We need to change people's beliefs and expectations and attitudes about what it is to thrive, what it is to be happy and fulfilled, right? We have ingrained in everybody this notion that to be happy is to consume. And you know, it's funny because we know the psychology, right? We know all the psychological research that says more consumption does not equal more happiness above a baseline level, right? As soon as you're above Maslow's first rung, more consumption doesn't contribute to your happiness at all. But we tell people that it does. So we need to expect different things from our lives and from, you know, what success looks like and all of this, while simultaneously having reform in all the areas you talk about. Here's an interesting question that relates to this internal rate of return that I've always wanted to look into, but have not yet done it. When you go out and spend money, we know that you're contributing to environmental impact because you're buying something that needs to be produced. You're increasing impacts. So you say, okay, well, the solution is just not to spend money, then I'll keep all my money in the bank. Problem is the bank is taking all of your money and loaning it out 10x, right? And other people are spending it. So is not spending money actually worse than spending money? and that's I don't, some version of input-output LCA and sort of marginal consumption could work to answer that question. But Mario, you raise excellent questions that I don't know that I have great answers to.
Thank you very much, Trevor. And yeah, we have quite a lot of questions. So there is Tommaso first.
Hi, Trevor. Great presentation. My question is about innovation, technology, and investments. In the most optimistic scenario, I would like to ask you how your diagram, the economist one, would change, and also in relation to circular business models, like in which the manufacturer or the company would maintain the property over goods that would collect at the end, if in this case the displacement rate would be higher and there would be, let's say, a hope.
Yeah, great questions. I'm going to tackle the second one first. There are some circular concepts that are more promising than others. I focus on recycling because that's the part of the circular economy that everybody contributes to and participates in every day. So things like extended producer responsibility or business models like, do you guys know the interface carpet model? They ship out carpet squares and they basically sell carpeting or floor covering services rather than selling carpeting. And then so they'll go back and take the squares and they make them really easy to take apart so that they can then reuse the fibers and the backing for new customers. Then these nationally estimated displacement rates are just that. But you can devise a business model that bakes in a much higher displacement rate. You can be in control of your own business's displacement behavior, just like you can be in control of your own displacement of reusable stuff, right? It's up to you whether you use a bottle enough times to make it worthwhile. You can devise a company or a business model that does the same. I think a big piece of this, and people are starting to fold this into the circular economy concept now, is products as a service or virtualizing, right? And saying, you know, let's sell. People don't actually want to own a phone; they want phone services. So let's rent the phone as a service and then take it back and make it so it's really easy to refurbish, to swap things out. You guys have actually a really cool company over in the UK called Fairphone, where it's a modular phone that you can swap out parts. they hate us in the United States, and they haven't released a phone that we can use over here, unfortunately. But but that's there's specific business models that I think have more promise. As far as technological innovation, I'm less optimistic, only because we have to remember that efficiency increasing technologies. Well, first of all, not all technology is efficiency increasing, right? Some new technology is decidedly efficiency decreasing. And it cuts both ways when it comes to efficiency, because yes, we save some, but we also have the common rebound effect, right? The more well-studied rebound effect, which is just energy efficiency. So we have SpaceX, for instance, using reusable rocketry. This is a cool technological innovation that reduces the impacts of each space launch because we can reuse the booster shell. But SpaceX's whole business model is spaceflight, launching satellites to space is now so much cheaper, and so they launch way more rockets. So we have some rebound there. So I'm less convinced by the technology, but I do think there are interesting business models out there that can work better than just recycling.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think Azar wanted to ask a question as well.
Yes, thank you very much for the great presentation. It was very interesting. Yeah, on slide 2020, I saw that you demonstrated diagram that you have used markets in between each part. So I suppose they're all secondary markets. I was wondering if you have ever thought about tertiary markets and so on for closing these loops, and is it possible to implement tertiary markets and multi-level markets on material component and product level for this displacement?
Interesting question. I think we're going to go back to this diagram so we can all be on the same page. Share screen, there we go. So I'm actually approaching this from a perspective that this is all of those markets that you just described. The only way that that the circular economy can matter, can benefit, is if the secondary versions of things, so all of these bottom activities, are actually competing with the primary versions. So these top three boxes up here. If they're not competing with one another, then they can't possibly help, because they can't possibly displace any primary production. So whether it's a secondary market or a tertiary market, it doesn't matter so much from my perspective, as long as they're substitute products, right? So if secondhand clothing or third-hand clothing, like however far you go down the list, if that's competing with primary clothing purchases, then there's a potential for benefit. If they're not competing with one another, then there's no potential for benefit. So cars are an interesting one, because cars get sold many, many times before they eventually reach their true technical end of life. And you can actually make a pretty good argument that whether it's being sold for the second time or the 15th time, it doesn't really matter, because it actually, there's a good argument to be made that every sale actually just helps displace primary production when it comes to cars, because you're fulfilling a need of transportation services. And so there's sort of like a national or a global need for person kilometers driven, right? And if you're driving them in a secondhand car or a third-hand car, then you're not driving them in a newly produced car. So maybe I just haven't thought about this enough, and maybe I'm missing something in your question, but I don't know that the level of the market matters, as long as people in this market, the consumers, the buyers in this market, are looking at both types of products coming in and making a choice between the two. Right, this is why I said the refurbished phones, the people who are buying refurbished phones generally aren't also looking at a new phone, because it's just not a feasible option for them. And people who are looking at new phones generally aren't going to be looking at refurbished phones because why would they, right? If they can afford a new one. Does that make sense?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think Kevin wants to ask a question as well.
Yes, I wanted to ask, because you, at the beginning, you said you had discussion, for example, on CNN, but do you think people really want to hear this message? I often find people are not happy to hear that what they think is green is not green at all. They prefer to ignore it often.
Yeah, of course. Maybe if you followed the aluminum paper that Roland and I published, maybe you noticed there was also a response to that paper, and then a response to the response that came from somebody who was hired by the Aluminum Association. Right? They hated this paper. And so they hired somebody to write a response to it, which we then had to respond to. It's sort of this academic version of a Twitter war. And no, I think Michael Smerconish put me on the show because he likes to be controversial and edgy, and sort of say things that people are generally, oh, I don't like this. So no, it's a very unpopular message. I think though, when you combine it with Remy Trudel's work and people recognize their own behavior in that, right? They're like, oh, I do feel better when I recycle something. And I know that they're like, oh, I know I shouldn't buy this plastic bottle, but I'll recycle it and it'll be okay. And people can recognize their own behavior in that, and people start to say, oh, okay, maybe there's something to this. But no, it's super unpopular in just about every field.
Thank you, Trevor, and very good comments about the Fairphone in the chat from Kevin about the fact that a more modular product actually had a worse environmental performance if there were not enough people essentially, properly using the phone according to its specifications. So a very good example that probably links together both the displacement effect that Trevor was mentioning and the behavioral issues also at a consumer level. I think we have got Paula who asked the question. Would you like reading the question yourself, Paula? Or otherwise, I can do that. Okay, you have no microphone. Yeah, that's fine. So Paula is asking, what are your thoughts on the role of the consumer and user? Most public policies on circularity position the customer as a passive actor in transition, whose role is to consume circular or green products. However, consumption is still being promoted at the center of the transition. The discourse is not to not consume, rather than simply shift to consuming green and circular. How can public policies tackle this issue and make individual citizens active participants in the transition in a way that is not through shifting consumption patterns?
I think I got most of that. Do you mind pasting that into the chat really quick? Because you cut out somewhere in the middle, and I want to make sure I get that.
I've just copied.
Yeah, the role of the consumer.
Yeah.
Passive actor. Right. So the discourse not consume, to shift. Okay. Yeah. So again, as a consumer, you have full control over your own displacement. The problem is your consumptive choices affect the whole market. So you might say, okay, I'm only going to buy secondhand things. That's fine. You've displaced all primary production for yourself, but you have also reduced overall demand for primary products, And if enough people do what you do, then the price of primary products will actually go down because demand has gone down for them. As the price of those primary products go down, some people are going to say, well, okay, I'm going to switch back to consuming primary products. And again, since these are substitutes, the prices of both substitutes are going to go down. Overall consumption will go up. So you have control over yourself, but in the aggregate, consumer behavior does affect prices and then affects everyone else's behavior as a result. From a policy perspective, I think there's, and I still need to write this paper, and now one of you can steal it, and that's fine, do a better job than I would. From a policy perspective, we have tended to focus on subsidizing secondary or circular economy activities as the policy lever, right? To give incentives to circular economy businesses, these sorts of things, which then lowers the price, right? And the idea is it incentivizes people to consume these things rather than their counterparts. But as we talked about, the effect is that all prices are lower. The alternative, less popular, but possibly more effective policy lever is not to subsidize secondary, but to tax primary production, right? To tax the linear economy rather than subsidize the circular one. And the difference is, so taxes and subsidies are two sides of the same coin, but the difference is that if you tax primary production, then it raises the prices of primary products. And again, these are substitutes, so that's also going to raise the price of secondary products, and it will lower overall consumption. This is the theory. I need to subject this to some data and actually see whether this holds true. But taxes are, of course, a much less popular policy lever than subsidies. You're probably not going to get elected or re-elected if you are very, certainly not in the United States, if you run on a campaign of we're going to tax primary aluminum and steel and all this stuff, you probably won't have a very successful run. But purely from understanding the economics of these competing products, that does seem like a more appropriate policy lever, or at least more helpful policy lever. Yeah, so it's tough, right? You have your individual behavior, but that also affects the whole market once you scale up from you to everybody.
Thank you, Trevor. I think Amos wanted to ask a question as well.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Trevor, for your provoking presentation, especially for some of us still in our PhD programs. I'm specifically looking at the environmental implications of transition towards a circular economy. So I have a question for you. So if recycling is not bringing any positive returns or outcomes as expected, like for instance, avoiding the primary production as well as in delaying delivering the materials to our landfill. So what should we do at the moment? I mean, in light of the global trend where there is a push for reducing the emissions, also moving towards low carbon economy. So at the moment, what should we do?
Amos, who's the we referring to in that question?
Well, okay, the researchers or the policymakers at the moment. Which direction should we take?
Okay, so I'll answer it, the best answer from a research perspective.
Okay.
What we should be doing as researchers is trying to answer this empirical question of how much rebound happens, right? To what extent are these circular economy activities actually realizing their potential benefit, and to what extent are they not because they're subject to these effects? As we have barreled into this concept of circular economy on the assumption that circular things will displace linear things without ever testing that assumption. And I think it's super important for us to try to answer that question in specific, right? Look at a particular material in a particular market and try to answer this question for that, or look at a particular activity and try to answer whether it's going to actually displace a higher impact alternative. Also, I think I'd love to see every LCA that involves recycling in the end of life. I'd love to see that LCA include some error bars specifically about displacement, right? How much? So we're modeling end of life recycling, and we're assuming it's going to displace this material. As part of our scenario modeling, we should say, well, what if we have displacement rates ranging from 0 to 100, and what if I picked the wrong substitute material, right? What if this end of life steel is actually going to displace plastic or aluminum? How does that change my overall findings? I have not seen that really in any LCAs, and it would be really helpful to do. So we're all researchers here, so I'll give you the researcher answer. The policy answer, I think, is, I don't know. I'm not a policymaker, so.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you, Trevor. I think we have final couple of questions. There was Ben asking a question.
Thanks, Andrea, and thanks very much for the presentation, Trevor. That was really interesting. A couple of questions. Firstly, I just wanted to ask, the economy side of circular economy has been overlooked. Why do you think that is the case? And also, you tantalizingly mentioned at the end of your presentation, time for something new, which I take it you meant in terms of revising economic incentives, but I just wondered if you could shed any more light on what you might be driving at in that sense.
Yeah, I can only speculate as to why the economy part of the circular economy has been ignored. My suspicion is that, again, this is a concept that was been sort of spearheaded by non-economists. And so the sort of economic principles that underlie were I don't know if they were ignored, but they certainly weren't front and center. So this idea of markets mediating consumer and producer behavior just wasn't included. I think there's a lot of, so the circular economy aligns really, really well with this narrative that we want to be true. It's the same narrative as energy efficiency and decoupling and all of this, that we can have our cake and eat it too. We don't have to change any of our consumptive choices. We can still go on consuming as much as we want, and we'll save the world by just hooking by just taking this line and circling it around into a circle, and that will solve all the problems. And we can go off doing what we want to do, live the lives we want to live, right off into the sunset, and it's fine. It's a very compelling story. And so I think it's so compelling that we just ran with it without investigating it. Same as the energy efficiency rebound story, right? We just run with it because it sounds great. And then we turn back and we're like, oh, wait, there may have been unintended consequences here. The maybe it's time for something new part is, yeah, the more I think about this, the more I think that real environmental protection and conservation, regeneration of natural spaces is fundamentally incompatible with a growth-based capitalist system. I don't think the two can coexist. So the question is, and all of the problems that we're running into here, all of the problems with the circular economy, with recycling, with energy efficiency, they're all a problem because of the capitalist system. They exist as a result of it, and therefore can't be fixed from within it. So maybe it's time for a new economic system. Maybe it's time for a system that, and I don't know what it looks like, and there's only a handful of people that are really starting to think about this. You've got the Kate Rayworths of the world, and the Naomi Kleins of the world, and Garo Perovitz, and people like this that are focusing on new models like co-op businesses or radically democratized capitalist systems. Different ideas. In my Journal of Management Inquiry paper, I was just, the JMI is meant to be a provocative journal, so I said, well, maybe the way forward is a new tribalism, right? Or as I say, a communism, right? Where we go back to sort of things that work for people that emphasize community and smaller structures rather than globalized economic systems that people can't really understand. Practically speaking, how do we do this? I don't know, right? But this is where I've sort of ended up in my thinking is this is the major roadblock. And so this is where I want to spend some time thinking about how we get around or through that roadblock, revamping an economic system. Big just a small task, I know, to just redo the global economy, but.
That's great. Thank you very much, Trevor. I think we have time for a final question. I think Raymond, Trevor has already responded to your question. We will make the recording available to everybody so that you can maybe look at that. Again, I think we have got Sophia who had a question. I would like going first, Sophia.
Hello. Thank you for your presentation, which I found enlightening and somewhat depressing. And feel free to laugh at this question because I'm not an economist. But in one of the earlier seminars, Janet Potocznik raised that recycling is used because it's simple and understandable. And one of the weaknesses, therefore, is that the circular economy has a digestible circular image that paradoxically plays into consumerism. And as you raised, one of the market interaction is much more complex. So I just wondered what symbol you would use to incentivize the public consumer to consume less, if a circle is going to work.
Okay, so it's a good question, right? And it's a good question because it does play into the psychology here, right? We've been trained that these circular arrows are good, and we, you know, they're always green, and we feel good when we do it. What symbol? Right, because the market, the diagram that I had on the slide with all the markets, right? That's not going to win any advertising awards, right? That no one's going to get behind that. It's like, no, this is just a mess. I don't want to deal with this. Here's what I have tried in vain to talk with our waste management people on campus, just as a test, to say, what if instead of having these three bins, I showed you a picture of those three bins, right? The paper, the plastic, and then the trash. What if instead we had bins that said bad, 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 right? Not because right now it's bad, good, good. Right? What if it was just bad, bad, bad? And anytime we're putting something in the trash, we're made to feel bad about it. Whether it's recycling or trash, I don't care. As soon as you're disposing of something, you're made to feel bad. Maybe that carries through to your marginal purchase, right? The next time you're considering buying something, you're like, well, I know I'm going to have to throw this away, and I know I'm going to feel bad about it when I do. So it's taking that recycling psychology and turning it on its head. So I'm actually surprised this question hasn't come up. A question that I often get is, so should we stop recycling? And my answer is probably yes, not because I'm so convinced of my own research findings, but because I'm really convinced of Remy Trudel's research findings. And if you remove recycling as an option for you, then you're forced at the time of disposal to fully contemplate the environmental implications of your choices. And the hope is that that feeling of, ugh, I've made a bad choice carries over to the marginal purchase, and it reduces your incentive to make that next purchase. That's the best I can come up with, is just say all the options are bad. And also, if you're focused on disposal, you're focused on the wrong thing. You need to be focused on the next thing that you buy. But I don't know how to turn. We need a marketing person to figure out how to make a symbol or a slogan around that.
Thank you, Sophia, for a great question. Trevor for a great answer. I think we had Raymond who I don't know, Raymond, we have got 4 more minutes. If you want to ask your question, it's fine, given that we don't have anybody else in the list. Raymond?
Unchanged consumer behavior. I think it may have been more or less the same question that we just addressed. Yeah. Just looking at the chat. So.
Okay, no, that's fine. Then, if I may, then Trevor, I've got a very simple question myself. I mean, you know, in a lot of the examples, and you know, I think the most effective one you made to me was the one of the can. So the fact that, you know, every time we put the can in the recycling bin, well, in our mind, something happens. It's like, you know, we think, okay, because of this, 1 can less will be produced by the aluminium industry. But this doesn't happen, of course, you know, because we have markets and because aluminium companies have a sort of incentive to grow and to extract more raw materials and not to decrease their primary production. So is there a role for some planning in the economy? Do you think, I mean, we should bring back some element of central planning, even within the framework of a market economy? Do we need to have a mixed economy where, you know, we have markets for set of things, but more strategic resources are handled in a different way? What's your view on this?
It's a good question. Now you're going to make me go on record as not only being a communist, but a communist. But it certainly could, without saying whether it's the way forward or not, it certainly could be a piece of the puzzle, because if you have the secondary people and the primary people in some sort of coordination, then you can say, okay, we recycled X amount, so let's reduce primary production by the same amount. You certainly would have that control. We have to just sort of step back and acknowledge how drastically opposed that is on so many levels to the system that we have, right? You're basically saying no more competitive market for certain materials, which means the prices of these materials will be higher than they are now, which means that people will consume less, which is all, we were all great environmental things, but socially speaking, people are going to be up in arms, right? When their MacBook suddenly costs, you know, 50% more because the aluminum casing is so much more expensive. It's not a terrible idea if we're going to have world resource czar, and Andrea, I nominate you for that position. Of world resource czar. You know, it could be a way forward, more centralized planning. It's just that sort of goes hand in hand with reimagining the economy entirely, I think, at this level.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I share this view. So thank you very much, Trevor, for a very interesting seminar. I think, you know, we have had an impressive debate, a lot of great questions coming from our early stage researchers, PhD students, and it has really been a great presentation. Yeah, we hope to stay in touch with you. Unfortunately, at the moment, you know, the activities of our consortium are quite limited by the pandemic, in the sense that, you know, we are running seminars online. Also, the network schools that we run, the winter schools, the summer schools that we run are happening online. But if in some time we go back to some kind of normality, it will be our pleasure to invite you physically. And of course, I mean, we'll take care of all the arrangements to Europe. and maybe to spend some time together, because we think it will be very beneficial for our cohort of early stage researchers to hear more from you.
That'd be fantastic. Yeah, and I also was going to say, you know, you all are working on, I'm sure, really fascinating things here. So if if anything that you're working on seems to have an overlap, or you want to work together, or just get my perspective on something, reach out, shoot me an email. I'm fascinated to hear what this group is working on and the questions that you guys are trying to answer. So definitely stay in touch.
Thank you very much, Trevor. Have a good rest of the day, and talk to you soon.
All
Bye.
right. Thank you so much.
Bye.